David Glazer became Hitler shortly after turning 23. And actually the power of Hitler, Nero, Torquemada, Stalin, or Mao was mere child's play compared to the force David wielded. It is uncertain who bestowed him such a might. Perhaps God, or maybe his Son, Jesus Christ, who always better understood the needs of little humans wandering upon the surface of the earth. It all started on the 28th of July, 1998, precisely 4 years after the death of the last white rhino. Dusk had fallen, and Judy Glazer shouldn't have been returning home alone. She shouldn't have taken a shortcut through Nelson Park. And she certainly shouldn't have forgotten the sleeping gas spray. 3 grim, big men raped her, scratching her delicate skin with their unshaven faces and panting curses in her face, curses meant as caresses. Judy acted conventionally. Having reached home, she told her husband, David, everything. And in the morning, when he left her alone for a moment, she threw herself out the window. Worth to add that Judy was in her 3rd month of pregnancy. And David loved her as deeply as a man can love a woman. As for the numbers, it's impossible to gauge precisely. Each of the deliberate wars, the Pan-Arab conflict, or the First American Crusade annihilated far more lives than David's actions. However, Glazer had killed quite enough people to be brought before the tribunal in The Hague. The fact that it was David who received the gift bears every mark of injustice. Plenty of people before him had been far more battered by fate. But that we know well, there's no justice in this world. Some are bald, others hairy, some wise, others foolish. There are barren whores and good girls who conceive on the first try. David in turn possessed the gift of killing. It happened the next day. He walked, dazed by sobbing and alcohol, stumbling along the street with a heavy, unsteady step. People avoided him because he wouldn't move out of their way. He wandered aimlessly, and it was purely by chance that he found himself at the entrance of a dive called Broughton's Public. He stopped. Leaning his hands on the fence, he pressed his face against the bars. Though clear vision had recently become a problem for him, he saw everything distinctly here. 27 men sat at the table set outside. Their faces were sharply defined, as if lit by a halogen. Unshaven cheeks, swarthy complexions, noses accustomed to clashes with others' fists, hairy hands, dark grime under their nails. He saw them well, scoundrels and drunks, guzzling liquor from dawn, beating their wives, ready to plant a glass shard in a face for a few pennies, spawning dozens of little thugs. Why? The thought flitted through David's mind. That short why contained many questions. And then the answer came. There is no actual reason for them to live. They could die one by one or all at once. It wouldn't matter to anyone, except maybe to those women who were slapped around, to the late-night passers-by mugged in alleyways, to the young vagrants whom no one would father anymore. Oh yes, those bloodshot faces, murky eyes, broken noses, scars on cheeks, anchors tattooed on arms, fists always ready for a fight were vile, cruel, and evil. They destroy everything good and beautiful. They frighten, wound, kill. Anger, sorrow, and despair had consumed David for many hours. In that moment, David himself became anger, sorrow, and despair. I wish you all dead. Every single one, he said, looking at the men in Broughton's Public. And he killed them. David was still walking around drunk. He sobered up only to realize that another dose of alcohol was the only thing that could save his head from exploding. His stomach had stopped rebelling, it accepted every new liquid in any quantity, his intestines absorbed what was needed, and his kidneys filtered the rest. He lived like that for a week, then another. Halfway through the 3rd week, David's body declared a strike. His hand couldn't lift the bottle, and when he forced his entire will to do it, he no longer had the strength to open his clenched mouth. He swallowed a handful of sleeping pills and collapsed onto the bed. He slept for 2 days, and when he woke, he felt hunger and exhaustion. The world seemed grey and blurred, like a car window during a nighttime rain. In the evening, he turned on the TV. For the first time in 17 days, he listened to the news. They were showing Broughton's Public. Every day they showed that pub, and every day they talked about the death of 27 people. David stared at the TV screen with his mouth hanging open and listened. He remembered Broughton's public. He'd been there, after all. This wasn't a drunken hallucination. And he had wished death upon them all. Impossible. Such things don't happen. He believed in probability calculus. He also believed in miracles. He didn't have to strain himself to test it. In the very same news report, pictures of Ethiopian terrorists were shown. The same ones who had already killed 7 hostages and were holding 4 times as many. "I want you to die," David said slowly. "Ligyasu, Ursimo Zordo." He listed their names. "I want you dead." Night approached more slowly than Soviet tanks towards Yerevan in 1993. He waited for its arrival, with both radios and the TV on, and then, when darkness fell outside, he gulped down coffee after coffee and waited. Around midnight, however, sleep overtook him, his first sober sleep in 3 weeks, the first without nightmares. He woke up in the morning. The radios chattered, and on the TV screen, a buxom blonde was enthusiastically enjoying her sister's husband, a scene she'd repeated over 40 episodes, bringing a bit of entertainment and emotion to hundreds of thousands of housewives for a long time. Then the news came on. The commentator's voice barely reached David's consciousness. What mattered was what the monitors behind the reporter showed. 13 bodies covered with white sheets, neatly lined up against the wall of some grim, dilapidated building. The pale, but now relieved faces of the hostages, whose guards and executioners had died in their sleep that night. All of them. David understood he had received a gift. At first, it terrified him. His rational mind flailed within the cage of experience and knowledge, desperately searching for an answer to the question, how is this possible? He spent the entire day in the library, reading, watching, leafing through, flipping pages, and scrolling. He looked at hundreds of photos of oozing ectoplasm, reviewed dozens of accounts of past lives as Cleopatra, Napoleon, or a beetle, learned the secrets of Madagascar folk medicine, gazed into the face of a zombie, and watched levitating spoons. He came across wax dolls meant to be pricked with needles, learned African spells for a crocodile's tail, and listened to the ritual chants of spell-casting Papuans. And nothing. This result was, in fact, what he expected. As already mentioned, David was a rational and enlightened man. On his way home from the library, he thought the whole matter over and came to some fairly concrete conclusions. He'd gone insane. Or he'd become an experimental rat in an alien experiment. Or he was dreaming. Or God had pointed his finger at him. Or Satan had. Maybe they did it together? David had always suspected them of sharing similar goals and means. Really though, he didn't care. David's memory hurt. The voice of a woman, the scent of a woman, the image of a woman lodged in his brain like glowing coals. Love had fused with hatred. These two emotions pumped the stream of David's thoughts, just as the 2 chambers of his heart pumped blood through his veins. He couldn't help love. But he could feed hatred. And it demanded nourishment more than the belly of the largest whale. David set to work methodically and systematically. Having gathered a pile of the latest newspapers in his room, he began to go through them. He decided to test how his command had to be phrased to effectively kill. He began with experiments. He pointed his finger at the picture of a serial killer without reading his name. He uttered the name of a Colombian mafia boss who had been released on bail. He wrote down the alias of the commander of an Israeli concentration camp in Sinai. He pointed to a white Bic whose unidentified owner would drive through the night streets of Belfast, killing late-night passers-by. The next day, David read about their deaths and understood that the easier part of the task was behind him. He now knew that anyone clearly identified in his command would die. That meant the guy in the photo, the person with a particular name, the man sitting in a specific cell, the person who owned such and such a car, the man doing this and that. But a second problem remained, 100 times more serious. David knew, as history teaches, that to cleanse the world of evil, one cannot blindly swing a club, crushing both the guilty and the innocent. Justice must be like American missiles, flying between swings and obliterating the headquarters of some Arab thug just behind the playground. Justice must strike hard and relentlessly, but precisely, like a sniper rifle, not a shaky machine gun mounted on a cart. So who should he target? David kept thinking. And he wasn't the only one. "My name is Silver," said the man entering his room. He was short and stocky, with grey hair combed forward from the crown to cover his forehead. Not a bad comb-over, thought Milo Kronstadt, IT engineer. His unshaven face could have belonged to either someone in their 30s as well as in their 50s. Dressed carefully but not elegantly, he moved stiffly, like an old-fashioned officer. "Major De Silva. From today on, I will be your father." They nodded in greeting, a developer, a lab technician, 2 police officers, and a secretary, 12 computer screens, 3 printers, and a wall screen, white-grey like a crumpled bedsheet of a 12-year-old. Faxes and telephones, with direct satellite connections to every place on Earth. This is how the new boss was received by the team tasked with the location of David Glazer, who, in the meantime, had begun mass production. He produced corpses by a cheap, defect-free method, bringing joy to the souls of gravediggers, stonemasons, and priests of various cults, while driving police officers to the brink of a nervous breakdown. He knew a bit about programming, which made his job considerably easier. He hacked into police records to pull out data on murderers. He became judge, defense attorney, prosecutor, and executioner. On the second night alone, thousands of men across the world perished. They died from heart attacks, cancer, brain seizures, strokes. They choked on their own tongues, their hearts, livers, and pancreases burst. They died on prison cots, in brothels, in cheap bars, in their wives' beds, in hotels, in public restrooms. They died in unison, the wave moving instantly. And because they died on every continent and across all time zones, no one initially noticed the phenomenon. But Death, the comforter, was panting loudly as she swung her scythe, and eventually, her grunts reached the relevant authorities. From there, the information traveled via the fastest transmission line straight to the terminals in Major De Silva's office. There, the data was processed, and it turned out that a substantial portion of the night's corpses were known criminals, previously convicted or suspected of murder. David sat at his computer, going through data. Thousands of data entries about thousands of people. When he deemed someone guilty, he would say their name. Slowly, but relentlessly, he was eliminating one of the castes of the criminal world. And the next ones were already waiting. "You tell me," De Silva used to say, "who is doing this, how and why, and I will explain to you the rest." Glazer was a decent programmer, but not a perfect one. Often, he encountered blocks he couldn't bypass, or fell into traps, and then escaping took considerable time. Yet, the clock on the wall ticked steadily, each 2 minutes claiming another life. Tick, tick, the clock murmured. Thud thud, thud thud, beat the fading hearts. Tick, tick, the clock answered them steadily. But they were already falling silent. David scanned through the files of Interpol, European, American, and Asian police forces. China, Africa, South America, Arabia and the remnant of the Soviet Union he left alone for now. He planned to have a different kind of fun there. On the third day, he tackled drug dealers. Only on Thursday did he get to rapists. David worked tirelessly, pausing only for meals. "I don't know who it is," De Silva said, "but if not got, then I don't understand anything." Such a number of corpses couldn't escape the notice of journalists. To give credit to that not particularly intelligent tribe as a whole, they quickly figured out the pattern Death was using to appoint her lovers. And they announced it to the world. The next day, 3 murders were recorded across Europe. The perpetrators of 2 were caught and placed in detention, where they kicked the bucket next night. It was now clear to everyone that someone had declared war on the criminal world. Attendance at temples increased at an exponential rate. Flagellants appeared on the streets of Frisco. In Ireland and Poland, official preparations for the end of the world began. The first black pope residing in the Vatican remained silent. The white antipope residing in Avignon, who had recently received the tiara from conservative bishops, hurled anathemas upon the world. David at that time was already working in other regions. He wiped out 200 North Korean officials, depriving the small country of most of its great leaders, constitutional successors, sons of the East, and wisest of directors. Chaos erupted, other communists seized power, and those were also felled by David. 2 days later, the South Korean Corps was already stationed in Pyongyang. On September 12, the New York Times printed the names of 7 terrorists holding nearly 100 hostages at the Red Cross headquarters in Beirut on its front page. The following day, it published a list of the previously elusive heads of a drug cartel. David realized that the journalists were trying to manipulate him. For now, his goals aligned with the scribblers, so he didn't protest. He killed everyone on both lists. "Got something," said Milo Kronstadt. "Someone left a piece of their identifier in the Interpol files. I can't trace the sender, but now I know what traps to set." "Set them," Da Silva nodded. "Though I guarantee you, if the end of the world is coming, your computers will be the last to find out." Then came the turn of the enforcers from the hired Cuban battalions fighting in Grenada. Next, the dictators of Liberia, Sri Lanka, Albania, and Romania. David also took down a dozen or so Jewish terrorists responsible for planting bombs at Arab airports. For 3 days, the Pope had been lying prostrate before the altar in St. Peter's Basilica. The Pope was black, and by now no one doubted that the prophecies would come true. Devout women awaited angels with fiery swords, while science fiction fans anticipated the arrival of warm-blooded aliens. At that point, David decided to issue an open letter. He thought about it for a long time, aiming to give the message a perfect form. He released the whole thing onto the national network. To authenticate the message, he also included a list of notable figures who would be meeting the Maker that night. The message read as follows: "Motherfuckers, be afraid. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone," quoted Da Silva. "Now everyone's scared out of their wits, that's it." That was a mistake. A second one already. The message had only been pushed into the national network, but it was spread by the press and television along with the announced list of victims. Yet it still provided some clue, some information. Tick, tock, the clock ticked. Clatter, clatter, the wheels of the carts carrying bodies to the morgue rattled. Let's be honest, David took on such individualistic work not only because he was afraid of eliminating innocents, for one can't make an omelette without breaking eggs, though he did try to avoid that. He simply feared that by naming a group too broadly, like bald, middle-aged atheists, for instance, he might include himself in that description. So he singled people out one by one, which, on one hand, was obviously more exhausting, but on the other, it gave him the satisfaction of a hands-on, hobby-like task. On the 6th day, David didn't kill anyone. He spent the whole day dreaming about holding his wife's hand. "I think I can locate that terminal, but I have no idea how long it will take, an hour, 2, or a week," said Kronstadt slowly. "From now on, none of you will sleep. Get stimulants from the supply room." "A week without sleep? That'll kill us." "Then do it in an hour, or you'll leave your children orphaned." "I don't have children." The mechanism appeared simple to use, but its effects could be bizarre. Take this example. David says, "Let all those who killed someone for profit die." But what does for profit mean? After all, a police officer who kills an escaped murderer is earning money, a salary and a bonus. So, let's rephrase, may those who kill a person to take something from them perish. Okay, except that this police officer just killed a drug dealer to seize his coke, and the cop doesn't wake up the next morning. This clearly shows that language, while not the most precise out of tools at humans' disposal, gives things their ultimate meaning and shape. "Remember," said Da Silva, "whoever first figures out the nature of this force will rule the world." David held a photo of a woman in his hands. His fingers gently caressed the paper. In that time, 42 men did not get up from their beds. Tick, tock, the clock ticked. We-oh, the ambulance sirens wailed. Thud, thud, the stonemasons' hammers pounded. The girl looked from the photo with blue irises in her eyes. David brushed the paper with his fingertips, stroked her face, touched her lips and cheeks, caressed her hair. His lips were tightly pressed together. If only blood donation centers would start exploding too, Kronstadt tossed a stack of printouts onto the table. The Jehovah's Witnesses would get an orgasm. "You think they even know what that is?" Da Silva asked. The pan-Soviet war died out like a fire extinguished by sudden rain. In all post-Soviet republics and countries, Sanaya Smirt began to consume the sons and guardians of the revolution. The majority of regime officials in Moldova and Ukraine perished, as did members of nationalist formations in Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Russia. Neo-fascists were dropping too, leaving a large number of vacancies at all levels of German administration. On the first day, 30 coffins were escorted to cemeteries, surrounded by a forest of Nazi flags. Shaved-headed youths marched in the processions, holding torches and wooden clubs high. Sieg Heil resounded across Germany from the Rhine to the Oder. The next night, roughly one-third of the funeral attendees for the neo-Nazi leaders met their end. The following day, nearly no one appeared at the party headquarters except for bewildered cleaning staff. Similar actions in France, Italy, and Free Sardinia led to the obliteration of the European neo-fascist movement. In Brazil, police officers known for shooting homeless children died en masse. In the US, a few notable clan members were sent to the grave. In South Africa, David eliminated all those tribe members who were known for placing burning tires around the heads of people from other tribes. He also accelerated the turnover within mafia families, taking down most at the top of the pyramid. The rest took care of each other. The war sparked by the survivors resembled the best days of prohibition. You need to think of him. De Silva's voice held a hint of fear and exhaustion, like, for example, Batman. This, thought David, is like war. When an enemy enters your country's borders, you defend yourself not only because he wants to take your land, gold, and women. He attacks your language, your culture, your dignity. He is an invader of the values you uphold. He breaks and humiliates them. Just like a criminal. He covets your wallet or the body of your wife. That's one thing. But at the same time, he kills feelings, desires, trust, and a sense of security. It's the same war. Often it even looks similar to the battles against the drug cartels of Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru. So I have to fight just as hard and effectively. My home, David whispered, will be your Nuremberg. Got him. Kronstadt shouted at the top of his lungs from his computer. De Silva, I've got him. David wasn't aware of the mistakes he'd made. One of his programs had left a trace. David's terminal had been located, right while he was preparing another list, containing whaling ship captains, elephant and rhino poachers in Kenya, leaders of the Khmer Rouge, and executives of corporations cutting down the Brazilian rainforest. He's human, said Kronstadt. I don't know how he's doing it, but I know who it is. Behind De Silva, a colorful globe rotated on the screen. Blue seas and Greenland shrouded in a faint mist, space black as a child's fear. De Silva stood, leaning his hands on the desk. We found him first because he was close. Here he was loading his messages into the network and got caught in our traps. So the responsibility falls on us. To throw a banquet in his honor? To kill him, Kronstadt. It was winter. They stood a few steps apart, making snowballs. You're stronger, Judy complained. Then throw first and run. I'll count to 3. All right. The snowball whizzed past his ear, and instead of running away, Judy ran toward him. I made a mistake, she murmured into his ear. David turned a pack of cigarettes in his hands. Throw and run. We can't kill him. We have to, Kronstadt. He's inhuman. He's taken down more criminals than all the police since Sherlock Holmes. You're wrong. You think we can use him, that he can be useful. You'll never control him, as he's the one that has power over your life. He's been choosing well. Does that have to change? It could, Kronstadt. Some matters can't be left to probability. This guy is a homicidal maniac. He's the nightmare of criminals. He's the fear of all people. You're confusing terms. A criminal is a social function. It's whoever is branded with the mark. For the Nazis, every gypsy was a criminal. How do you know who he'll deem guilty next? He can't be an evil person. We need to talk to him, set him straight. And then tremble in fear before an afternoon nap? Never, Kronstadt. Can you imagine living with the knowledge that one of his gestures? But it's a miracle. A miracle can't become everyday life, or it stops being a miracle. His name? No, De Silva. Kronstadt stood up from the terminal. I can't let you know. I love you, said Judy for the first time. And then for the first time he kissed her. Boss, please, don't move. His voice was trembling. Kronstadt held a disabling spray in his hands. I'll put you to sleep, and then I don't know. With a shaking hand, he dialed a phone number. Pick up, bro. Pick it up. The phone rang. Impossible, the phone was disconnected. The computer. The screen pulsed rhythmically, displaying a call signal. Who had found the access point? It was supposed to be restricted. David dragged himself from his chair and approached the desk. I'm here. The phone. Switch over. They've discovered you. By chance? A mistake. You're not a good programmer. I never will be. Listen, man, I don't care where you came from. They're going to kill you. I can't let that happen. What should I do? I'll give you names. There are 2 here now, but others also have access to the case. I'll put the ones here to sleep, and you'll make sure they die. Can you? I can. I'm dictating. Write it down. Robert Da Silva, Gren Ogba, Mario Pachavos, Dorothea Milne. Is something wrong? No. I'm Kronstadt. That's me. Got it? Yes. I'm switching off. Goodbye. Kronstadt turned to his commander. So, boss, shall we cross the... With you? Never. Da Silva lunged at Kronstadt. He had to leap across the table, reach out, and strike. Kronstadt simply bent his finger. Da Silva collapsed unconscious to the floor. The sharp smell filled Kronstadt's nostrils, his eyes welled with tears. To be sure, he also sprayed himself directly in the face. Place him in front of the screen. Someone's words tugged at his mind as much as the hands twisting his arms. He saw Da Silva standing slightly to the side, his back turned, facing the monitor. 2 brutes in internal security uniforms shoved Kronstadt into a chair. Only now did he feel the cold of the handcuffs on his wrists. Damn! Someone must have come in, found and revived them. Now watch, you bastard, said Da Silva. David ran down the dark street. Columns of cars stretched along both lanes like a giant centipede. With engines and lights off, the drivers waited. Some pressed their faces to the windows, someone even leaned out, another opened a door. But the rest obediently followed the orders broadcast on the radio. They were all afraid. Mutant. We don't know how he kills. We don't know how he dies. Don't get out of your cars. Don't use weapons. He can kill you. Kill you. Don't let him see you, hear you, feel you. Let your shadow not cross his path, your whisper not reach his ears, your breath not brush his cheek. Mutant. Death. David ran like a madman. The announcer's words, muffled by the windows but multiplied by 1,000 speakers, reached his ears, lodging in his brain, incapable at that moment of any reflection. But a helicopter was already following him, its rotor tearing through the air, 3 barrels aimed directly at David's back. A camera. A spotlight. A machine gun. Where is he running to? Da Silva asked. He didn't kill us, Kronstadt shouted. He didn't kill us. That's proof, isn't it? Why? No man can decide on his own what's good and what's evil. No man can be both judge and firing squad. You know that. Kronstadt, don't be foolish. Then what are you waiting for? For decision from above. David turned into a side street. There were cars here too, faces of curious onlookers visible in the windows. The black sky covered the street like a plastic sheet over a rat's maze. Of course, that's how it looked from above for astronauts and archangels. The phone rang. Yes, Da Silva said. Understood. He put down the receiver and leaned over the microphone. Do it. A beam of light carved its path through the icy air, surrounding David like a giant halo. The man stopped. He turned around. The helicopter descended, swaying slightly, its engine roaring. David showed his empty hands. He had no regrets. Certainly not. The only pity was that he wouldn't manage, that these fools' fear had thwarted his plans. Where the hell was he running? Da Silva murmured, watching the screen. Kronstadt, doesn't that route lead to the cemetery? Yes, Kronstadt whispered. Isn't it true, Judy, isn't it true, little sleepyhead, that it should be arranged so that a person can always finish the work they've started? A writer, organize the papers on the desk, cover the computer with plastic, sharpen the pencils. A machinist, sweep up the shavings, clean the machine, assemble the parts. A student, finish homework and pack books for the next day. Only then should they come and take you, then carry you away, shoot you in the back, without nervous haste and mess, because it's too important a moment for a person to be defiled. Death. He did quite a bit of good, said Da Silva. But he doesn't belong here, Kronstadt. He doesn't fit in. The laser dot marked the spot. The rifle spat fire. David's body was thrown backward. He doubled over, but the bullets kept crushing his flesh. In the spotlight, he looked like a ghastly creature from a Lovecraft novel. Hunched, deformed, torn in half, hammered by a relentless rain of lead, pressed into the ground. The helicopter swayed gently. David lay motionless. His brain and heart, lungs, liver, stomach, his legs and arms, all were thoroughly and methodically destroyed to ensure he would remain dead forever. People leaping from their cars didn't dare cross the circle of light. They stood, shouting and shaking their fists, praying and spitting, rejoicing and cursing. The helicopter's rotor tore through the night air, the beam of the spotlight trembling slightly in rhythm with the machine swaying. "It's over," moaned Kronstadt. "You murdered him. Such a great opportunity wasted." "It wasn't us," De Silva interrupted. "Seems this was meant to happen. Apparently, this time it's Jesus who washed his hands. Because, you know, Kronstadt, the astral hands of God must always remain clean."